Hello, everybody. This is Professor De Angelo again. We're in for our next installation for our early American history course. We're going to be talking today about the American Revolution, the actual fighting that led to our independence from Great Britain. Now, for some of you who aren't from the East Coast, some of the geography might be a bit hard to follow. So if you can get your textbook out, that might be a little helpful, and just turn to some of the maps. I will have them throughout the presentation, but they may not always be on screen when I'm talking about places. So you might want them out just to be handy for you, just in case that was what goes on. So when we're talking about the text, right, just don't forget that the authors provide videos that are on my Canvas page for this course. So you can always look up and click in on some of the discussions. They're not posted within the module sometimes, but they're definitely in there under the respective chapters. So take advantage of that if you can. So when this war breaks out, right, nobody really had a chance or felt that America had a chance to win this war. Great Britain was at the time considered the greatest and most powerful empire on the planet. The Americans had essentially zero resources to go after it. They had no navy, they had no army, they didn't have any gunpowder, they didn't have any of these things that would be considered normal. So the United States are going to have to depend on farmers and lawyers and all kinds of people who don't necessarily constitute good armies, right? So when we get to the year 1776, the American effort to defeat Britain was more inspiration than it was a reality. The army, as it was so constituted, was virtually all volunteers. So the American Army, or the Continental Army as it was called, involved volunteers from all 13 states, but there were also militias of the 13 states, and the real trial in many instances was coordinating the efforts of the two. So when George Washington heads north, he's trying desperately to take advantage of the early psychological victories that occurred in the war, namely fighting in Ticonderoga, forcing the British to evacuate Boston, and to a lesser extent Bunker Hill. These were all sort of psychological victories because the Americans were able to sort of school the British on just how capable Americans were at shooting. But we weren't really very disciplined at warfare, and this becomes really a major issue. So for Washington, he's going to find himself in a situation where, he can't make the kind of scoring that's necessary to convince the British that it's a lost cause. But at the same time, he's never going to be fully wiped out, which means that the fighting continues. So it's a bizarre reality that he's in. And this has a lot to do with the style of fighting that was considered en rigueur for the period, and that is European open-pitched battles. Now, if you've watched any movies of periods like the Napoleonic Wars or even the Revolution or even the Civil War, you'll notice that soldiers fought in lines called flanks, and their fighting style was done in a way to just basically overwhelm the enemy with gunfire. And then basically, based on head counts, you would either progress forward or retreat. And so in this very old European style, Americans were expected to just fight in very disciplined lines and follow very specific types of strategy. And Americans were not necessarily in that mode. We fought more like Indians than we did Europeans. And this led to a lot of confusion and misunderstanding. And so Washington suffers a lot of disappointing defeats because he really can't field a disciplined European-style army. but he has to live long enough in order for his men to learn. And that's the real sticky wicket for him. So as you can see on the map, George Washington has moved his troops onto Long Island in hopes of preventing the British from establishing a foothold in New York. So they evacuated Boston and moved to Halifax, Nova Scotia. And it was there that General Howe and Admiral Howe, his brother, met with General Burgoyne and schemed out a strategy for taking back control of the colonies. And it was based on a strategy of isolating New England, which was perceived as being the sort of brainchild of the Revolution. And so the strategy was referred to as cutting off the head so that the body would die. So this involved capturing or recapturing the Hudson River Valley and placing the British Army squarely in control of Manhattan, or broadly speaking, New York. So this is the essential strategy of the British. And Washington wanted to try to keep the British from getting a foothold in New York. So he bases his troops on Long Island, but quickly gets overwhelmed. The British put their largest army that they've ever sent to the New World onto Long Island. And what happens is the Battle of Long Island, or what some people refer to as the Battle of Brooklyn Heights, Washington quickly finds himself surrounded. Now, in the European model of fighting, that's called checkmate. This is why European soldiers of that period played chess almost constantly. It was meant to keep their strategic minds sharp. If you ever watch movies where they'll have old battlefields, right? And then you go into the general's tent and you'll see like a chess game there. And you think, what the heck would somebody do that in the middle of war? But that was because that's how they kept their minds sharp. And so General Howe assumed that he had Washington at a surrender. And so he backs off. But Washington doesn't surrender. Instead, he leaves his campfires burning and a lot of equipment and material behind, and scales the walls of Brooklyn Heights down to the East River and crosses it into New York, and then across to Fort Lee and down into Pennsylvania. And while that looks to us like a really brilliant move to get away and fight for another day, to the British, this was just simply not playing by the rules. And this is a problem because Americans needed to convince other European powers that we were a legitimate force to contend with. And so long as we couldn't win in an open pitched battle, the Europeans were not going to come to our side, even if they wanted to get at Britain, because we would be perceived as a lost cause, or at least a criminal endeavor. And so this becomes a very big deal. And Washington suffers a series of embarrassing losses. And yet, he gets to the winter of 1776. And we get to what's called the Battle of Trenton. And if you notice down here, it's across the river from Pennsylvania. Now, the Delaware River at the time, this is during a period known as the Little Ice Age. The Delaware River would actually freeze up in places. And so this was an incredibly difficult crossing done on Christmas night. So on December 25th, in the evening, Washington crosses the Delaware with all of his troops, horses, cannons, everything. It's a major endeavor, several miles north of Trenton, and then marches his men down. And on a day that's referred to as Boxing Day in Britain, which is the day after Christmas, the American Continental Army surprised Hessian troops, which were German mercenaries hired by the British, that were stationed at Trenton, many of whom were probably sleeping off a rather decent headache from celebrations of Christmas. And so this surprise attack was followed up by the Battle of Princeton, which is in January of 1777. This was an open pitched battle. And these two exercises demonstrated both to the Americans and to the French specifically that the Americans might be able to just pull this off because they were, in fact, able to, get their act together on some level. Now, it doesn't last. Washington retreats to Morristown, New Jersey, to recover and recoup his troops. There is an opportunity to train his army at Morristown, but it's also a time when epidemics were striking. Washington will order his entire army to be inoculated, which was an incredibly cutting-edge sort of thinking for the time. But he does last to fight another day, which I suppose is really the main part of it, right? So contrary to popular belief, the entire nation did not rise up in protest, right? So choosing sides became a very big deal. So there were really three groups in the colonies. The Tories, or American loyalists, were those individuals who really felt a close bond to the royal crown. They may not have liked the British Parliament, but they considered themselves British. And by this context, I mean subjects of the King of England, in this case, King George III. And felt that they really were British and did not want to be anything else. The American Patriots, also known as American Whigs, were individuals who were, quite frankly, fed up with the idea that they would ever be treated as British. And that was another key element to think about. Most of the Patriots were individuals who, for a very long time, were trying to argue that they wanted the same rights as other Englishmen. So many of the Patriots were people who just came to the realization they were never going to be treated like English people, so then why stay English? Now, there were also people who were just simply disinterested. These were largely people in the frontier. For a long time, they were people in the South who weren't witnessing any direct conflict or hostility and therefore felt, why get involved? And so this was going to divide the colonies, or presumed states in this case, quite a bit. There also needs to be a clarification. So as I just said, right, the militia that you read about in the text are state-run voluntary armies. Then these militias are very old. They go all the way back to the founding of the colonies. And so the army in this case is the Continental-wide Army, made up of volunteers that were being supported directly by the Continental Congress. So the fighting styles became important. Americans liked to take their time. They were used to saving their bullets, and so they would wait until they were sure that the enemy was close enough for the bullet to penetrate and to cause damage, if not a kill shot. And so they preferred to fight behind walls and trees and other sorts of obstructions. But again, as I said just a moment ago, you don't really win battles if you're not willing to go out there and face the enemy in that open pitch. So now, money and supply was a very big issue. We did not have a currency. So you couldn't even go out there and, buy products in the market because you didn't have a currency to buy them with. So Americans, some individual Americans will provide gold to the government, but we needed supply and finance from other sources. And we're going to do this surreptitiously, really, through France, some private bankers that are in Holland, Spanish bankers, and even some private investors that are going to be involved. And so we also want to look at the reality that there were degrees of loyalty. So I just talked about how some people really felt that they were British, but we always want to keep in mind that loyalty can be very conditional. And we're going to see that, I think, mostly in the South. But even out in the frontier, when frontiersmen who were mostly Scots-Irish, who already had a sort of disfavorable opinion of the crown, even minor incidences where British troops behaved badly would be enough for these Scots-Irish frontiersmen to join the cause. So, when they say loyalists, we have to remember they may have been a somewhat large group, but many of them were fence straddling in terms of how they stayed loyal with the crown. This document that you see gives you a good illustration of the variances. The third from the left is more of your militiamen, and then uniforms that are sketched right from variation of dress based on who's backing them, and so the man on the far right is sort of like a Frenchman who is there to help drill American soldiers. So now, the British plan in 1777 was to divide and conquer. So New England was seen as the problem, right? So the idea was if you could cut off New England from the rest of the colonies, then you could put all your attention towards defeating the rebels in New England. And so what happens is a three-pronged attack on New York City. So, I'm sorry, the state of New York. So what happens is the first would come south from Canada. This is General Burgoyne, who was going to march down through Lake Champlain and recapture Ticonderoga, and then conquer all the forts down to about Albany, New York. The second one would come from western New York State. As you can see from the map, there's a General Saint-Leger who was going to sail across the Lake Ontario and capture Fort Oswego, which had been sort of abandoned, but anyway, not so important. He was going to team up. He was supposed to team up with friendly Iroquois and march east to meet up with Burgoyne. And then finally, General Howe was to send troops up the river from New York City as soon as he established a foothold. And this three-pronged attack was going to officially cut off all of the Hudson River Valley and therefore divide the colonies and give the British an opportunity to simply crush New England, which General Howe and most of the British authorities thought would end the conflict, because once New England, the sort of mind behind the rebellion, was conquered, well then, everybody else would sort of like fall into obedience. So we get into really the largest failure for the British. So what happens, and I don't know if you can see this map or, get it out of your textbook, but Howe gets arrogant, in my opinion. He notices Washington's retreat from the battle after Princeton, and he assumes this is because Washington is so weak and so incompetent that he has rendered the so-called rebel capital of Philadelphia unsecured. Howe thinks that he has an opportunity here to sail troops into Philadelphia, as you can see, up through the Chesapeake, and literally take over the capital of Philadelphia and defeat Washington's army. Now, there's a number of problems with this. First, Philadelphia wasn't the capital of the United States. There were 13 capitals of the United States. This was a misjudgment on the part of Howe. In his eagerness to end the conflict quickly, he wasted a lot of resources on what I would refer to as sort of like a false target. So the Continental Congress didn't care. They met in Baltimore, they met in York, Pennsylvania. They would meet just about anywhere because it didn't matter where they were meeting. They were simply really diplomats from the various 13 states. So anyhow, it was a waste of energy. Second, Washington was never going to confront him full on in full pitched battle because he knew he would lose. So he would engage him partially, but not fully. And Washington was fully prepared to suffer defeats in order to stay alive. And that's exactly what happened. But in the meantime, Howe's resources were not being directed north to support Burgoyne. And Burgoyne is forced to surrender on October the 17th, 1777, which becomes a very important, some people call it the turning point of the revolution. Because with that, France signs, in January of 78, signs an alliance with the United States. And this triggers a war. And it's not a simple war. It's a very complex European balance of powers struggle. So if you notice, the United States forms an alliance with France in 1778, but then France signs an alliance with Spain and the Netherlands in 79, which is not, by the way, an alliance with the United States. If you notice, I did not put the U.S. in that alliance because they're not. Spain and the Netherlands do not sign an alliance with America. They do send funding through banks, but they're not directly, right? They don't recognize American independence or any of those things. But then finally, there's something called the armed neutrality. This was started by Catherine the Great of Russia. Now, it sounds like a contradiction in terms because it's an armed neutrality, but Catherine the Great forms an alliance with Austria, Prussia, and Sweden. And in it, they all basically state that they are prepared to stay out of this conflict. However, if Britain's navy tries to curtail their trading networks, they were armed and ready to join. Now, the aggregate effect of these alliances, in I think most historians would agree, is that Britain was never going to be able to send their very best and brightest to the colonies. They had to retain certain levels of readiness in England to confront a possible invasion of England. And this had been a fear of the British for a very, very long time. And so most of their ablest resources are going to be withheld from the American theater of war. And this benefits us an amazing degree because we never really confront the varsity squad, so to speak. So this is the portrait of John Burgoyne. And what's really sort of tragic for Burgoyne is this was primarily his strategy. And, he executed it precisely as he wrote it. And he is forced to surrender because he's completely surrounded. There was just no way for him to get out of that situation. Saint-Léger is stopped by the New York State militia, along with friendly Iroquois on the American side. And so Burgoyne is forced to surrender. Howe is really the responsible party. And yet, because he outranked Burgoyne in the, let's call it the aristocracy of England, Burgoyne will be reprimanded for his surrender. But General Howe is going to be allowed to retire without any blemishes. And it's really kind of a tragedy for Burgoyne. But it also, in my opinion, spells out the problem of the British strategy. Instead of looking at this situation as 13 individual problems to solve, Britain thought that it could come in there with overwhelming force and quite literally intimidate the colonists back into submission. And so Howe is replaced by General Clinton, and it becomes this theme. A commander is defeated, he leaves, he's replaced by another commander, but there's never really a conversation about replacing the strategy. And this allows Washington to continue his war of attrition, basically, to just simply run out the clock and force the British to constantly reassess whether it was worth continuing the fight. So we get into this middle colonies and the war in the East and the West, right? So when Clinton replaces Howe, he decides that there's two other areas to go to. Washington winters in Valley Forge, which is just sort of part of the American epic or saga of how miraculous it was that we survived. I mean, the numbers of men killed by frostbite and disease, and the number of people who just up and left to once their conscription was expired. And so in the frontier, we get two commanders. Now, John Sullivan was part of the Continental Army that came to address something that becomes known as the Bloody Year. 1777, the British paid their Iroquois allies to go into frontier settlements and militia encampments and to just engage in wholesale slaughter. Men, women, children, old people, it didn't matter. The British essentially paid the Indians per scalp, no questions asked. And this was creating a lot of unrest. Washington really didn't want to, but felt compelled to send a contingent of troops out west to try to bring that under control. And John Sullivan will be the person sent out to do this. This is not a proud moment in American military history, in my opinion. Sullivan will use very ruthless tactics to subdue the Indians. He will send disease-ridden blankets into villages to cause just pandemics and just slaughters entire villages, sets villages on fire. But it was in many ways sort of the tit for tat that was going on between these two sides. George Rogers Clark is going to lead what I'm going to kind of call the Green Berets of the colonial period. These were basically commandos that penetrated into the Ohio River Valley systems. And what had happened was the British commander Hamilton came down through what will become Ontario, Canada, into the western frontier. His task was basically to gather up all of those Indian tribes that had made the agreement with England that created the Indian Reserve, and to basically convince them that if they didn't join the British and fight the Americans, then the Americans would flood the Ohio River Valley with settlers, which really is true, and take away their sovereignty. And the hope was that these Indians would join up and fight the Americans and then be able to push directly east, as you can see in this map, which would have divided the colonies north and south. Well, George Rogers Clark has just enough troops, 125 in total, as I remember, and he's able to defeat the British at three major battles: Vincennes, Kaskaskia, and Cahokia. And these three victories become very important, not just in the immediate sense, because it sort of ends the British attempt to do this, but later on in the negotiations of the peace settlement, this will strengthen Americans' claim to the Ohio River Valley when it comes to drawing the map in the peace settlement. So when the British decided that this wasn't going to work, Clinton thought that the best way to do this was to go and rally the troops at the most loyal part of the colonial setup, in this case, the South. The British believed that if they were to move south, they could rally the loyalists to their side, turn over each southern colony to a loyalist militia and government, and then simply move north. Now, at the time of its initial creation, Clinton was still believing that Hamilton would win in the Ohio River Valley, cut across to about the Mason-Dixon line, approximately, if you will. And then Cornwallis would simply capture all of the southern colonies up to that point, and then those troops could then concentrate their efforts on the more rebellious northern colonies. Well, now, what they do is initially he sends a contingent down to the city of Savannah, Georgia. Now, this is not Cornwallis, by the way. This was done by another commander named Campbell. The British have done this in a number of military endeavors, and it's essentially an act of intimidation. They tried it in Falmouth, Maine, early on. I want to say in 1775 or early 76. They found out that there were privateers in Falmouth, Maine that were sailing out to disrupt British shipping and capturing materials for the Patriot militias. So the British decided that they were going to go in and teach Falmouth, Maine a lesson. And they thought that if they went in there and just showed how powerful they were, that the citizens would all shake in their boots and join the Loyalists and pledge their loyalty to Britain. So they went in and they set the entire port on fire. Well, the death and destruction they did essentially took any fence straddlers that still remained in Falmouth and made them patriots. Well, they tried again in Savannah, and they got the same result as in Falmouth. Some loyalists did rise up, but a lot of loyalists were very infuriated that the British would set Savannah on fire, and they joined the Patriots. So Clinton tries to regroup his efforts, and he sends Cornwallis down to the Carolinas. And as you can see in the map, the early goings are quite good. Cornwallis was able to, keep the Americans on their heels, and just like always, right? So anyhow, the battle in the South, or the war in the South, really ties into sort of an element of intrigue in the American army. Since Princeton in 77, Washington has had a series of failures, at least in the battlefield. Members of Congress and some members of the officer corps were embarrassed by this and felt that Washington really wasn't doing enough to take the fight to the British. So a murmuring campaign starts against Washington. And most of it was done in favor of Horatio Gates, to a lesser extent, General Lee. And so what happens is when Washington is trying to direct how to fight the war in the South, Congress overrides him and decides to send Gates to be the commander of American forces in the South. Now, this was a result of officers murmuring behind Washington's back and telling the Congress that Horatio Gates would be a better general. And this was all based on Gates' supposed victory at Saratoga. But when one analyzes that victory, one realizes that it was really Benedict Arnold and his forces and his command that turned the tide at Saratoga and made the victory possible. Benedict Arnold, however, was shot at that battle and was taken out of the battle. And therefore, when the victory did arrive, it was Gates, who was still standing, that got all the accolades. This, by the way, starts Benedict Arnold's little negative spiral into treason. But Washington finds out about this. He's at his secretary's desk writing a note when a messenger comes in and hands him a message that was addressed to his secretary. He doesn't realize it, opens it up, looks at it, and sees that his secretary is part of this cabal, if you will, that's intriguing behind his back. His initial reaction is to go berserk, but then collects himself and refolds the note. It gives it to his secretary saying, "Oh, look, this came to me by mistake, but I think it's for you." and it leaves the whole thing sort of up in the air. Well, at the Battle of Camden, Gates gets spanked. He gets absolutely humiliated and literally has to flee for his life. And so all this conversation about replacing Washington stops. And Washington gives the command to send Nathaniel Greene to replace Gates in the South. And Greene would lead Cornwallis away from his supply base and forces him to move north. Cornwallis tries to avoid this. He sends a message back to New York to General Clinton saying that he needed to be resupplied. Now, you might call this a organized retreat or a strategic retreat or whatever, but he wants to find himself a better position and regroup and get resupplied and do a counteroffensive. But when he sees Greene pulling back, he takes it as a sign that Greene is weak and vulnerable, and he takes the bait. He follows Greene into the mountains of South Carolina. And this is going to lead to something called the turning point of the war in the South. And this is also in October, but this is in October of 1779, I believe. And it's the Battle of Kings Mountain. And what happens is Greene had split his forces up and took Cornwallis on a little bit of a joyride through the backwoods in the Piedmont region of the Carolinas. And the Americans were really very good at this. And this is the militia under Morgan and the army under Greene and other commanders like Lincoln, who are really just taking the British on a wild ride, so to speak. And what happens is Cornwallis gets really clobbered and rather than surrender, retreats. And this is going to lead to what we call the Battle of Yorktown. Now, what we see here is that the battle is really about access to resupply. So as you can see, Cornwallis retreats to an area on the Chesapeake, and he's supposed to be resupplied by Admiral Graves. But what they touch on a little bit in the textbook, I think, is really quite revealing. Clinton is in New York, and he had been receiving intelligence that George Washington had been joined by a group of French soldiers led by the Comte de Rochambeau, and that they were just north of New York. This combined force was very threatening to the city of New York, and Clinton was terrified of losing his military foothold in New York, because just like Howe, he didn't want to have to evacuate his foothold in New York City, because then all their attacks would have to be from the water, meaning an amphibious assault of some form, right? They would have to reestablish a foothold somewhere else. And so Clinton hesitates sending the Navy with resupply. Washington and Rochambeau, however, are informed that the Admirals de Grasse and Barras were going to sail north to confront the British Navy. And this led them to move south. And as you can see, Cornwallis is going to very quickly be surrounded. Now, the real coup de grace comes from what's referred to as the Battle of the Capes. And this is in September of 1781. And as you can see here, the French fleet with de Grasse and Barras get to the Chesapeake before Graves does. And in the Battle of the Capes, it's a naval battle where the French are able to force the British to leave and surrender the ground, or water in this case. And that meant that the Chesapeake River the Chesapeake Bay was completely cut off from any sort of resupply that the British could make. So Cornwallis finds himself with his back to the water and the French fleet cutting him off from resupply. So the Battle of Yorktown is, in fact, a series of skirmishes where Cornwallis is trying to find a vulnerable spot where he could escape out and find another way to get resupplied. And so, as you can see, whether it's Wayne and Richmond or Lafayette at Yorktown or Washington and Rochambeau who come around to his rear flank, he's completely surrounded. And this is why Cornwallis has to surrender. Now, as soon as the war had begun, the United States had sent diplomats to England to work to end it and secure a peace. And the negotiations would fluctuate throughout the war. They're going to be led by Benjamin Franklin and John Adams. Franklin was stationed primarily in France, and John Adams was primarily in the Netherlands. To a lesser extent, Silas Deane had been trying to get support in Russia. Now, they will be joined by John Jay in the final negotiations. But as soon as the war in the New World ended, it became obvious to the diplomats that France and Spain were not interested in ending the war. Right? England's army was defeated, but her navy was not. And nor were the people of England, who were more than happy to keep fighting. So France wanted England beaten and was unwilling to broker negotiations with it for the United States. So all of a sudden, the entire premise of the Franco-American alliance starts to lose its value. And so the Americans had entered the war against England, but had never sided with the Americans. So this complicated scenario started to spell a disaster. The Americans were potentially going to lose the peace, even though they had essentially won the war. So the negotiators were in a very unique problem. So our quote-unquote allies were essentially out for themselves and were no longer really interested in whether the American enterprise went forward or not. And you know, I think it's important to realize that Britain, France, Spain, the Netherlands were all to some degree a form of monarchy. The idea that they were going to allow some Republican experiment to thrive in the New World was a really tall order for the Americans to make. And so what happens here is that the Americans are going to enter into solo negotiations with England. Now, this comes about for a very specific reason. The Tory government of England collapses with the embarrassment of Cornwallis and the surrender that happens there, and the obvious reality that this war in the New World was not coming to an end in a way that Britain had hoped. So that the Tory government collapsed. It was replaced by a Whig government. So as you can remember from our last chapter or last installation, the Whigs in England had a sort of soft heart for the colonists and for the patriot cause. So Benjamin Franklin sees an opportunity and goes and engages in direct negotiations with Great Britain. And in it, the British decide to make rather lenient terms for the Americans. So we get what's called the Peace Treaty of Paris of 1783. And this gave the United States an incredibly generous concession. As you can see, the Americans are given the territory all the way to the Mississippi River, and from the Great Lakes to what's referred to as the 31st parallel, which is essentially the northern boundary of Florida, and the Floridas were returned to the Spanish. So France gets no concessions in the New World except for those fishing islands that we had talked about previously and their continued control of Haiti. So for the French, it's really an expensive sort of well, let's just call it a very expensive status quo antebellum, really, because it really created a situation where the French were no better off than they were before the war, and they had expended quite a sizable sum of money. So for the American Revolutionary cause, the true revolution was this Republican ideology, right? The idea that you don't need a monarch, that you can actually depend on the sovereignty and the of the people, and create a truly free and great government. And the sort of notion of the social contract, something that had been discussed for well over 100 years among Enlightenment scholars and philosophers, was now going to be the basis of government, right? So all of the states, starting in 1776, had constituted themselves in new governments with written constitutions. Some had simply taken their old royal charters and rewritten them and expanded them. Others had started from scratch. So, for instance, Massachusetts just starts all over again, as does Connecticut. And so what's sort of borrowed from the English but made as a clear priority was this idea of a Bill of Rights. All the states were going to have some form of Bill of Rights. And this was to spell out something that's super important to all of us today as Americans, and in fact many countries all over the world, and that is the civil liberties that are afforded to all persons regardless of their background, simply because they're human beings. And the idea that the government cannot do some things simply because the people's sovereignty has to be maintained. So what's going to happen is this new national government, if you will, that gets created in Philadelphia under what's called the Articles of Confederation is going to be a collection of 13 independent states with a very weak central government, and for the purpose of hopefully creating free and independent states. So for the social revolution, obviously many of the loyalists are going to flee. Some will return to England. Benjamin Franklin's son, will, the former royal governor of New Jersey, he will actually go back to England, or not. Yeah, I guess you could say back to England. He goes to England and establishes himself, lives a rather successful life. Benjamin Franklin and his son will never truly reconcile. It's probably one of the most bitter aspects of Benjamin Franklin's life that he regrets up until his death. But many loyalists will flee to Canada, into what is now Ontario, and that will have an impact later on. Freedom of religion, something that had been touched upon, I guess you could say, at the Peace Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, really gets expanded way beyond that concept in this new American nation. These individuals are going to be afforded the level of religious freedom that really just isn't seen in any other part of the world, really. But equality has its limits, and it certainly did in America. While slaves who fought for the Continental Army are going to be afforded freedom, some Southern militias will reward slaves for their service with emancipation. The fact is, slavery was still practiced and would remain a major political and social issue for another 100 years. So this is the true embarrassment, I would say, the dark cloud that hovers over the revolutionary victory. And this paradox of slavery just is never going to go away. And it unfortunately will require the bloodshed of several 100,000 Americans. Women are also not included in this new taste of freedom. Now, status and agency are very important things for everyone, and I think it's important to remember that slavery existed all over the world at the time, and women were in subordinate places virtually everywhere in the world as well. And so, in some senses, the status and agency of women in this new America were better than they were in England or other parts of Europe. But they are not going to be given the vote. Neither the central government nor the states will give women additional political status and agency. And then for Native Americans, the implications were very wide and very negative. So the Iroquois, who had for centuries fought off French, British, Dutch, Swedish attempts at conquest, basically divided among themselves during the American Revolution. Some of the Confederation supported the British, and some supported the Americans. I'll admit, I don't understand why any Iroquois nation sided with the Americans. It was clear that the British were going to be kinder to the Indians than the Americans were. But that having been said, this divide within the Iroquois will break them up permanently, really, for the remainder of that century and really up until the 20th century. So property owners also have a clear advantage. This new democracy, where all citizens had a say, was going to be limited to those citizens who owned land. So for those members of the general population, this new foundation of freedom would not include them, really. Yep, they wouldn't have to worry about the British telling them who they could sell to and who they could trade with. That's all gone. However, they were still going to be at the mercy of property owners when it came to the major decisions being made at the national and even at the state level. So the religious developments, right, for Independence Day really becomes a sort of clarion call to expand religious freedom. So the revolution sparked a sense of nationalism amongst the newly freed colonies, and it was not long after the revolution that July 4th became a day set aside to memorialize the event, right? So unlike the old world, the United States did not have an ancient history to draw from for its national identity. And so this portrait here is of something that becomes rather unique. The the African American community will start to expand itself. And this portrait here is really the first African American preacher who will speak at a congregational church, right? So this in all areas, religion and social and economic construct, the revolution breaks into a new form of expression on all levels and allows for the United States to grow in a variety of ways that really isn't seen in other parts of the world. And this is going to contribute to what we've discussed really since the very beginning of the colonies, this idea of American exceptionalism, that for one reason or another, the American experiment is uniquely different from those of other nations.